Late last night, in the wake of Prime Minister Netanyahu's re-election and his statements just before Election Day that he didn't see a Palestinian state happening, White House officials said the U.S. might now stop protecting Israel at the United Nations, a reversal of decades of policy.
Netanyahu pulled off a strong victory in Tuesday's election. President Obama and his administration clearly think that victory came at the expense of any hopes for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Almost as stunning as Netanyahu's victory is the fact that as of right now, President Obama still has not picked up the phone to call and congratulate his frenemy. Today, Netanyahu struck a conciliatory tone, calling Israel's bond with the U.S. unbreakable. He said his address to Congress was not an attempt at partisanship. He just felt an obligation to speak up about a deal with Iran that he thinks is dangerous. But reports indicate the White House, as of now, might not feel that same obligation to raise its voice in defense of Israel in places like the United Nations.
Barack Obama has congratulated Benjamin Netanyahu after his victory in the Israeli election. In the phone call, he emphasized the deep ties between the two countries. The message was not all rosy, though. Washington is now hinting it may withdraw its support for Israel at the United Nations over the issue of Palestine and the Iran nuclear deal.
Meeting with Britain's Prince Charles and his wife Camilla, President Obama refused to comment on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's become something of a royal pain to the White House. Administration officials say they're furious over Netanyahu's remarks in the final moments of his re-election campaign, pointing to the Prime Minister's rejection of a Palestinian state in this interview as a key reversal that would damage prospects for Middle East peace. Asked whether a Palestinian state would not be formed if he remains prime minister, Netanyahu said, indeed. Was the president personally disappointed in Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments?
I would certainly acknowledge that the president is aware of the comments and noticed them. I don't think I would characterize his reaction. But I think that there are obvious policy implications for Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments.
In a post-election interview, Netanyahu completely flip-flopped, saying he now wants a peaceful two-state solution with Palestinians. But the White House is also outraged over Netanyahu's comment that Arab voters were heading to the polls in droves, a remark aides to the president blasted as racially tinged and undemocratic.
I think that comment and that tactic was something that was noticed, not just here in the White House, but by, I think, people around the world. And that cynical election day tactic was a pretty transparent effort to marginalize Arab Israeli citizens and their right to participate in their democracy.
Netanyahu insists Arab Israelis will always have the right to vote, but they're not buying that at the White House, where officials are threatening to allow votes at the United Nations in favor of a Palestinian state, a measure the U.S. has blocked before. Republicans who invited Netanyahu to speak before Congress against the U.S. nuclear talks with Iran are saying, get over it.
What about the administration's sort of lukewarm reaction?
Lukewarm?
The Obama administration and Benjamin Netanyahu need to wake up, understand the realities of what they can and cannot achieve, and try to restore some adult supervision.
عندما يتكلم السيد نتنياهو عن انه لم يعد هناك حل للدولتين، لم يعد لا يريد ان تقوم بدولة.
Benjamin Netanyahu's statements against a two-state solution and against a Palestinian state, and the calls by Avigdor Lieberman to kill all the Arabs in Israel, all of this is proof, if correct, that there is no seriousness in the future Israeli government about a political solution. We will not change our position. It is our right to demand international legitimacy and to go anywhere in the world to achieve that.
أي مكان في العالم.
President Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu are not fans of each other. It's clear by now. The relations have eroded to the point where the U.S. may change its long-standing policy of blocking all UN Security Council resolutions on the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Up to this point, the U.S. has said that it supports a two-state solution, but would be against any attempts by the international community to interfere in the negotiations. The negotiations never moved forward, and we're obviously nowhere near a two-state solution. In the last days of his election campaign, Benjamin Netanyahu made it clear that he doesn't want a two-state solution. Here's the White House response, just from today. Now that the foundation has been eroded, it means that our policy decisions need to be reconsidered, and that's what we will do. Benjamin Netanyahu, in his latest interview, tried to walk back on his earlier statement about the two-state solution, saying that he actually supports the two-state solution, but U.S. officials seem unimpressed. There has been so much tension between the two governments lately. The Israeli Prime Minister's uninvited visit to Washington, uninvited, of course, by the Obama administration. His speech before U.S. Congress, where he blasted the Obama administration's diplomatic efforts with Iran. The U.S. has just removed Iran and Hezbollah from its list of terrorist threats to the United States. There is a notable rift between the governments of the U.S. and Israel, and this could be leading to real changes in policy.
All right, Guy, it's certainly going to be interesting to watch this all play out. Everybody was waiting for the elections. Now they've happened, and we are going to be watching carefully as we move forward. Guyana Chichikan from Washington, D.C. for us.
You can't force the people of Israel who've just elected me by a wide margin to bring them peace and security, to secure the state of Israel, to accept terms that would endanger the very survival of the state of Israel. I don't think that's the direction of American policy. I hope it's not.
Our preference is certainly, and it is today, it was yesterday, it was 3 days ago, for a two-state solution negotiated between the parties. Certainly the Prime Minister's comments from a few days ago brought into question whether he was remained committed to that.
President Obama called the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, to congratulate him this afternoon. Meanwhile, there's back and forth with the White House and the State Department saying there may be a change in U.S. policy when it comes to the two-state solution, pushing the UN to pressure Israel to do that. Here's exactly what Prime Minister Netanyahu said before the election the other day about this topic. This is through a translator. Anyone who is going to establish a Palestinian state, anyone who is going to evacuate territories today is simply giving a base for attacks to radical Islam against Israel. This is true reality that was created here in the last few years. They who do not understand that stick their heads in the sand. The left are doing it, sticking their head in the sand time and time again. The questioner, so if you are Prime Minister, a Palestinian state will not be formed? He says, indeed. Megyn Kelly asked him about that.
In 2009, you said you supported a peace deal that would recognize a Palestinian state, but the day before Tuesday's election, you completely reversed that. Why?
I didn't retract any of the things that I said in my speech 6 years ago, calling for a solution in which a demilitarized Palestinian state recognizes a Jewish state. I said that the conditions for that today are not achievable.
Because basically the Palestinians are tied with Hamas.
I'm just wondering why the White House is being so selective with the rhetoric that Prime Minister Netanyahu has used to base these considerations to policy going forward.
Because of his comments days before the election, it does raise questions about his commitment to that solution.
Why are you willing to put more weight on those comments than you are today?
Certainly the Prime Minister's comments from a few days ago brought into question whether he was remained committed to that.
Why do you assume that his comments, why do you assume that he's lying today?
I think he was the Prime Minister 3 days ago, so certainly we can't, forget about those comments.
Why do you think the White House is refusing to accept the prime minister at his word today and instead accepting him at his word earlier this week?
Look, this is a very cynical move on the part of the administration. It knows that what happened on Tuesday was sort of an election year ploy, and Netanyahu has gone out of his way today in your interview and lots of other statements to make it very clear that what he meant, or at least the softening of it, is that he is open to a two-state solution. But the conditions, the fact that the Palestinians have not offered anything near what any Israeli government would be able to accept, are simply right now not there. The major change, the major event that's occurred in the view of the Israelis is that the government of the Palestinians is now in an alliance with Hamas. How can you make a peace agreement, a two-state solution, hand over control of the West Bank to a government that includes Hamas, which is not only dedicated to the destruction of Israel, but rules a territory called Gaza, from which it has twice initiated terror wars because it simply will not accept Israel's existence.
That's what Netanyahu said earlier this week when he said, I think whoever moves to establish a Palestinian state or intends to withdraw from territory is simply yielding territory for radical Islamic terrorists and attacks against Israel. And that's how he explained his comments earlier this week and how he explained them to me tonight. But so here's the interesting thing, Charles. So the White House has two statements to choose from. The one he made earlier this week and the one today. And they've chosen the one that's more contentious, the one that they say they don't want, the one that, oh, wait, happens to open the door, in their view, to them bypassing Israel and Netanyahu altogether and going to the United Nations.
That's exactly what they're doing. They're choosing the outlier statement, whereas Netanyahu and his government have been clear throughout. Look, the fact is that what Netanyahu said, even in the outlier statement, was there won't be a Palestinian state while I'm the prime minister. Well, I have news for the White House. There's not going to be a Palestinian state. There wouldn't have been, even if Yitzhak Herzog had won the election, the Labor Party, because there's no government in Israel that would hand over the West Bank to a government that includes Hamas. And also what's changed in the region is that there are terror organizations, Al-Qaeda affiliated in Sinai, Hamas in Gaza, you've got Hezbollah in Lebanon, you've got ISIS practically in the Golan Heights. Israel is surrounded in a region that is roiling with instability, and it would be very hard, impossible right now, for any government to conclude a deal that hands over the West Bank in a condition where you don't know if you're going to wake up tomorrow and find the West Bank in the hands of terrorists. The same way we woke up and discovered that a pro-American government in Yemen all of a sudden had become a new government, overthrown by a new government that is a client state of Iran, and we had to evacuate our embassy in a panic.
In the meantime, Josh Earnest came out today and said, well, election rhetoric has consequences. Words matter, he said. Words matter, he said, Charles. The White House said that today.
They are either trying to stab Israel in the back by supporting a UN resolution that will call for withdrawal, unilateral withdrawal of Israel without peace, without recognition, without a renunciation of terror, and will simply leave Israel helpless against 50 years of American policy, against the existing UN resolution, which is from 1967, the famous resolution 242, which says that Israel will withdraw to secure and recognize boundaries, and these are insecure boundaries. So this would be either it's a revolution in our policy, or we're going to force a unilateral withdrawal, which could be fatal for Israel, or it's a cynical attempt to distract, create a second issue, a crisis with Israel, because we are about to hear an announcement about a catastrophic deal with Iran over nukes, and that would be a way of distracting Israeli and pro-Israel attention from the nuclear issue,
that gets
and
right to it.
Weaken any opposition.
That gets right to my next question, which is right before we came to air, President Obama released a video address directly to the Iranian people. Here's part of it.
The days and weeks ahead will be critical. Our negotiations have made progress, but gaps remain. And there are people in both our countries and beyond who oppose a diplomatic resolution. My message to you, the people of Iran, is that together we have to speak up for the future we seek.
What do you make of that?
Well, this is unusual in American history. A president addressing a serious adversary, enemy of the U.S., where the leader leads chants of death to America. And in the midst of it, he takes a swipe at a most loyal ally in the region. Obviously, he was referring to Israel. If only he would address as warmly the Israelis as he does the Iranians and their leaders. This is quite remarkable. And look, it's not new to have a New Year's greeting. He did that in 2009 and ever since. There's nothing wrong with that. But to include this kind of swipe at Israel in addressing the Ayatollahs is really rather new and quite startling.
Charles, great to see you, sir.
Pleasure.